Bryan J.L. Glass's Dark Spaces. Part 1, Stratan Dreams. Book 1, Desolation's Tears. Read by the author. Chapter 20. Duel. 1. It was fast. One of the creature's claws was already swinging for Talitha's head, even as it spun around to face her. She redirected her opening strike to deflect that slashing talon, but the arm at its waist sliced through her thermal jacket at the belly, and she felt blood begin to seep down her abdomen. The creature finished its turn, and another 2 claws slashed toward her. Another blocked, as the other struck home across her left shoulder, striking deeper than she was comfortable sustaining. The first 2 claws were ready to strike again, with the second set already poised to follow in their wake. Talitha had to be faster. Again she blocked, was struck, deflected, then received another tear. Only now, she'd already adjusted her battle posture, and the last strike only claimed pieces of her coat. Her instinctual defenses had her backing up. Almost immediately, her own attack had been subverted into self-preservation. Within her mind, she willed herself into her next higher processing phase, clinical mode. Knowing her available senses would amplify, her tactical assessment would speed up, and her musculature and reflexes would meet the challenge. The pain would also increase, but she could still choose to ignore it as her blade now met all 4 talons in their rotation. Although the creature dominated her immediate world, Talitha's peripheral senses had also enhanced with her increased operational mode. Veslin broke from the tech's grip and scrambled directly for the still prostrate form of Tiff, lying against the snowbank her bike had created. The tech hesitated for a second as if choosing between 2 options, then allowed Veslin to slip away while he made a dash toward the Elder, the one he'd arrived with. The Elder was rising and shouting something she didn't understand. The words seemed to take a relative eternity to escape his lips. Raish was broadcasting something as well, but until his sentence was complete, it was perceived as only modulating tones of static. But he was tracking the dance she and the creature made toward the redemption side of the boundary road, leaving the others behind him. Talitha realized they were each witnessing a superhuman display on her part, and she despised the assessment even as she made it, the word implying the superiority of her own skill, yet judged through the filter of their limitations. To the constrained vision of a mere human, her sword arm would be a blur of motion they would be unable to follow. But this thing she battled required nothing less than her best, and her fear rose that even all she had was not going to prove enough. She felt rage building in the creature. To her surprise, it emanated genuine hatred. Talitha was no empath, but the thing she fought projected psychic wrath as if it were a conscious choice. The Elder's voice finally coalesced in her mind, only she still didn't understand what it meant. Kakor! She's fighting Kakor! It was intended for someone else, but upon staring into the thing's maw, opening and closing upon a meal that remained tantalizingly out of reach, and sensing its frustration and fury, she felt Kakor was apt. After a succession of effectively deflected strikes, the Kakor paused for an instant and fell back upon the support of its tri-spread tail. Talitha uttered an involuntary grunt of severe pain as it brought its bottom legs into the fight. 6 talons against a single sword. Talitha entered her highest mode of function, immersive. All but the immediate menace faded from her perceptions. But it wasn't going to be enough, as the Kakor landed strike after strike, shredding her clothing to ribbons and spraying her blood in a mist. All her wounds were still on the surface, even the deepest ones, but it was only a matter of time before her own formidable reserves would exhaust. The creature would land a debilitating blow, and she'd yet to deliver a single counterstrike against anything but its talons. 2. Racious static finally clarified through her berserker-like haze, most likely due to its frequency. Synthetic and more easily processed, his words landed at the forefront of her consciousness like a metaphorical brick.
"Get clear,"
he'd broadcasted.
"and I'll light it up."
That made sense. He was offering her an out. All it would cost was her acknowledgement that he'd saved her life a 3rd time. Another talon sliced at her thigh. It was now or never. She'd need to risk all 6 limbs striking her to deliver the one of her own that she hoped would give the Kakor pause. There was little variance in its attack, as they'd achieved a rhythm of blocks and deflection. Good to know its reflexes weren't as creative in their adaptations. Talitha abruptly stopped and thrust one strike where the heart of the beast would reside had it ever been human. 6 talons cut through her remaining tatters. 2 struck deep, but her own jab caught it off guard, and the Kakor's own apparent mechanism for self-preservation abruptly stopped its limbs from completing their deadly arcs, withdrawing its upper 4 appendages into a protective cross over its punctured chest, while its legs dropped to support the entire beast hunkering down defensively before its foe. Talitha released the broadsword, leaving it embedded in the Kakor's chest, took 1 step to the right, and leapt as far as her wounded legs would propel her. She landed 7 meters away, into the snow piled along the side of the road, but she heard the first explosions while she was still airborne. Raish had wasted no time. The instant she'd disengaged, he'd pulled the trigger, unleashing the full power that had made the AR-500K the ultimate crowd suppression tool. An entire block of building facades that comprised the Redemption City limits exploded as thousands of explosive-tipped fragmentation shells fired past the Kakor and detonated on impact with whatever they struck. A cacophony of overlapping concussive bursts resounded in rapid succession, sufficient to break Tiff's stupor as she awoke abruptly with a shrill cry. Talitha looked up from her inglorious landing and witnessed all 6 limbs of the Kakor, its head, trunk, and tail, dancing in the shower of sparks and tracer trails. Hundreds of shells, yet not one had struck home. Until 1, 2, 3 in rapid succession detonated on the creature itself, but they only deflected off its limbs. 4, 5. Then the Kakor ran half a dozen steps and leapt. 50 meters to the wall of the building closest to them. Raish tried to follow it, but when he realized the third member of the original captives was in his line of fire, he pointed the crowd pleaser skyward faster than he could let go of the trigger. Those paydays were detonated by particles carried on the breeze, and the sky exploded above them. The Kakor smashed through a wall-mounted ventilation grating and then vanished within the cloud of steam, no doubt to nurse its wounds and satisfy its ravenous hunger on less aggressive prey. Delayed explosions followed as the crowd pleaser struck flammable tanks within the buildings, and soon many tiny infernos merged into one great conflagration. 3. Regardless of wherever the Kakor had gone, each and every one of them needed to follow suit. Only 5 of Onath's thugs had escaped, and they had scattered to the wind before Talitha had leapt for their compatriot's blade. Talitha staggered up, and the elderly man gave the tech instructions to inquire about the third of their party still bound at the wrist. The tech's pistol was gone. "I have 1,000 questions," the elder blurted at Talitha. "But getting off these streets takes precedence." "Agreed," said Talitha, then turned her attention to Veslin and Tiff. "I got her," Veslin cried, holding the shaking girl to her side. She stared at Talitha in disbelief, shook her head, and stammered out, "Thank you." Raish approached with his strange minimalist gait, as if nothing had happened. Talitha beat him to any words. "That's 3, she said. For a second, she thought she caught another of his curious moments where he seemed genuinely taken off guard and didn't know how to process whatever he'd been dealt. Veslin seemed again on the verge of tears. "We've got to get out of here, but there's nowhere to go, Tal." She started to hyperventilate. I'm so sorry." Talitha could only recover Veslin's pistol in silence. The elder assumed a commanding demeanor. "Is that your transport?" he asked. Talitha nodded and she pointed. "And that's Tiff's bike." "You may call me Merrin," he said. "And I know a place we can go if we leave now." Talitha and Veslin exchanged glances. They'd both seen that the man was sweating, acquired a nervous tic that made his head shake minutely, and his breathing was shallow and rapid. His nerves were slightly better than Tiff's, but considering what they'd just experienced, neither woman seemed inclined to hold it against him. Talitha nodded and Veslin guided Tiff toward the transport. "Dak," Merrin shouted, "can you handle a hoverbike?" The young tech guided the third former captive to their assembling group. "Can do," he answered. "Then bring the girl's bike with us," Merrin instructed, and then turned to the third man. He was still stumbling about in utter disbelief. He stammered, That was a Kakor." Merrin confirmed. Yes, it was. Now, Dr. Sintel, you're going to let these fine people stay at the lab with us." The doctor nodded as if that was all the decision-making he was capable of. Talitha climbed into the driver's seat, while Veslin held Tiff with her in the front passenger seat. The girl had begun to sob gently. Merrin and Dr. Sintel climbed into the rear seats. Dirk steadied the hoverbike, ensuring it was still functional. He'd also reclaimed Talitha's damaged pulse rifle and the gore-spattered sword the Kakor had yanked from its chest. Raish climbed onto the side of the transport as Talitha restarted the engine.
3017,
he stated. Dirk asked, "What's that?"
"That's how many shells I fired at the creature,"
Raish answered. The transport drove into the Desolation night, in the opposite direction of the flashing lights approaching from the Heart of Redemption. Talitha was taking them the long way to the address Dr. Sintel had supplied. This has been Bryan J.L. Glass's Dark Spaces. Book 1, Desolation's Tears. Read by the author. Audio and video production by A.J. Blackburn. Original music composed and performed by Frankie Caffrey. Bryan J.L. Glass's Dark Spaces and BJLG's Dark Spaces are copyright 2022 by Bryan J.L. Glass.